The air inside the emergency room of St. Jude's Memorial was always thick with a specific kind of tension, a mixture of cheap floor cleaner, stale coffee, and the unspoken anxiety of people waiting for bad news. But on this particular rainy Tuesday night, just past 3 in the morning, the atmosphere shifted from standard exhaustion to pure terror in the span of a single heartbeat. It began with a sound that didn't belong in a hospital, a deep, metallic crash that vibrated through the linoleum floor, followed by the shattering of heavy safety glass at the main ambulance bay doors. The alarms didn't just beep. They shrieked, cutting through the low hum of cardiac monitors and the soft murmur of nurses trading shift notes. Before anyone could process the noise, a shadow fell over the triage desk, a silhouette so massive it seemed to block out the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor. It was a man, but a man of such impossible proportions that the automatic reaction of every person in the room was to freeze. He stood a full 7 feet tall, his frame wide and heavy, clad in a torn, mud-cattered canvas jacket that looked as though it had been dragged through a forest. His face was a mask of sweat, blood, and dirt, his eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal. For a second, there was total silence, the kind of silence that happens right before a bomb goes off. Then the giant roared a raw, guttural sound of pure agony and charged straight into the heart of the ER. Security guards, men trained to handle rowdy patients and late-night altercations, took one look at the advancing colossus and hesitated. He wasn't just walking. He was a human freight train, knocking over metal instrument trays, shattering privacy screens, and sending wheeled stools flying into the walls. Nurses screamed, diving behind desks, while a doctor instinctively grabbed an elderly patient's gurney and wheeled it backward into a treatment room, slamming the door shut. The giant was headed directly toward the secure pediatric wing, his massive boots leaving bloody, muddy tracks on the white floor. He was swinging his arms blindly, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps that sounded like a broken engine. To anyone watching, it looked like a mindless rampage, the actions of a dangerous man fueled by adrenaline or something far worse. But amidst the absolute chaos, standing directly in his path, was Clara. Clara was 23 years old, weighed barely 110 pounds, and was wearing a pair of bright pink scrubs that still had the crisp folds of a new purchase. It was her second week on the floor, her first official night shift without a preceptor holding her hand. The veteran nurses called her the rookie, often leaving her with the paperwork and the low-risk triage duties because they thought she was too soft, too quiet for the brutal reality of a county emergency room. Yet, as the 7-foot giant bore down on her, his massive fists clenched and his chest heaving, Clara didn't run. She didn't scream for help. Instead, she took a deep breath. As the giant closed the distance, just feet away from plowing through her, Clara dropped her clipboard. The plastic cracked against the floor, a sharp snap that briefly pierced through the alarms. She didn't brace for impact. Instead, she opened her arms wide, completely exposing herself, and dropped her gaze not to his threatening fists, but directly to his midsection. Her eyes locked onto a specific, subtle detail that everyone else in the room had missed in their blind panic. Underneath the heavy, mud-soaked canvas coat, the man's left arm wasn't tucked away to shield himself or to prepare for a punch. He was cradling something. Clara stepped directly into his trajectory, extending her hands, palms up, and shouted a single sentence with a voice so calm, so utterly devoid of fear, that it seemed to cut through the man's hysteria like a knife through fog. She didn't command him to stop. She didn't threaten him with security. She simply said, "Let me help her." In an instant, the giant's entire demeanor changed. The forward momentum of his massive body halted so violently his boots slid on the wet tile. The rage in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a devastating, hollow desperation. His knees, which looked strong enough to support a building, suddenly buckled. With a heavy, echoing thud, the 7-foot man collapsed directly onto his knees right in front of the rookie nurse, burying his face against her legs and letting out a sob that shook his entire frame. The entire ER seemed to hold its breath as Clara slowly knelt down onto the dirty floor right in front of the weeping giant. The security guards arrived a second later, their batons raised, shouting at Clara to get away from him, but she held up a single hand, never taking her eyes off the man. She gently placed her small hands on his massive, trembling shoulders, feeling the intense heat radiating from his body and the violent shivering of severe hypothermia. Gently, with the patience of someone handling a fragile bird, Clara reached toward the folds of his heavy canvas coat. The man didn't fight her. He opened his arms, peeling back the thick fabric to reveal what he had been running so hard to protect. Tucked deep inside the jacket, wrapped in a threadbare, soaking wet flannel shirt, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Her face was dangerously pale, her lips a faint shade of blue, and her breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible. As the trauma team scrambled into action, the complexity of the situation began to unfold, bringing a fresh wave of tension into the room. The veteran charge nurse, Evelyn, a woman who had seen everything in her 30 years of medicine, rushed over with a gurney, her eyes wide as she looked from the tiny girl to the massive man still kneeling on the floor. Evelyn tried to gently pull the little girl from the man's arms, but the moment her hands touched the child, the giant's eyes flared with panic again. A low, defensive growl rumbled in his chest, and his massive hand clamped around Evelyn's wrist. It wasn't an attack. It was a protective reflex, but the grip was tight enough to leave a bruise. Evelyn froze, terror flashing across her face. Clara immediately intervened, placing her hands back over the man's eyes to draw his attention away from Evelyn. "Look at me," Clara whispered, her voice steady and warm. "Look at my eyes. We're going to save her, but you have to let us take her to the bed. I won't leave her side, I promise you." The man stared at Clara, searching her face for any sign of deceit. Slowly, his grip on Evelyn relaxed, and he allowed Clara to take the limp body of the little girl into her arms. Clara didn't waste a breath. She stood up, holding the child tightly against her chest, and rushed toward Trauma Room 1, with the giant immediately scrambling to his feet to follow her like a massive, protective shadow. Inside the trauma room, the atmosphere was chaotic. The monitors were hooked up, and the initial readings were terrifying. The little girl's core body temperature was dangerously low, a severe case of environmental hypothermia, and her blood oxygen levels were plummeting. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, began shouting orders for warm intravenous fluids and lab draws, but every time a nurse approached the bed with a needle, the giant would move closer, his massive presence throwing a shadow over the entire team. He couldn't speak. Clara realized then that the man wasn't just silent out of shock. He was physically unable to vocalize words. He made low, clicking sounds and pointed frantically at his daughter, his hand shaking so badly he nearly knocked over an 4-pole. Dr. Harrison lost his patience, telling security to remove the man from the room because he was interfering with their ability to work. But Clara knew that if they tried to force him out, the man would fight, and in his desperate state, people would get hurt. She blocked the security guards at the door. "If he leaves, he panics, and we lose control of the room," Clara argued, standing her ground against the senior doctor. "Let him stay, but let me manage him. He trusts me." Dr. Harrison glared at her, but seeing the flatlining oxygen numbers on the screen, he nodded curtly, telling her she had exactly 2 minutes to keep him calm or he was being sedated. Clara turned back to the giant, who was watching the medical team pump warm air under the blankets of his daughter's bed. She grabbed a pad of paper and a pen from her pocket and pressed them into his massive hands. "Write her name," Clara commanded softly. "Tell me what happened." The man stared at the pen as if it were a foreign object, his thick fingers clumsy against the plastic. With agonizing slowness, his hand trembling, he began to form letters on the paper. His handwriting was shaky, childlike, but legible. He wrote one word, "Lily." Beneath it, he drew a crude picture of a car upside down, followed by the word "water." Clara's breath hitched as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. There hadn't been a report of a car accident on the main highway, which meant this had happened somewhere remote, deep in the mountain passes that surrounded the valley. This man had walked, perhaps run, for miles through a freezing, torrential downpour, carrying his daughter after their vehicle went off the road into a river or a ravine. He hadn't just broken into the hospital out of aggression. He had exhausted every ounce of human strength he possessed to bring Lily to the only place that could keep her alive. He was bleeding from a deep laceration on his temple, and his left shoulder was visibly dislocated, hanging at a bizarre angle beneath his torn coat, yet he hadn't made a single sound about his own excruciating pain. The emotional weight in the room shifted heavily as the staff realized the magnitude of what this man had done. Evelyn, looking ashamed of her earlier harshness, stepped up with a warm blanket and gently draped it over the giant's massive shoulders, which were now slumped with exhaustion. But just as a small sense of order began to return, the heart monitor connected to Lily emitted a sharp, continuous, terrifying tone. Her heart rate had dropped into a lethal arrhythmia. "Bradycardia," Dr. Harrison shouted, his voice tight. "She's going into cardiac arrest. Start compressions." Clara didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the step stool beside the bed, placed her hands on the center of the little girl's tiny chest, and began rhythmic, precise compressions. The giant let out a sound that tore through everyone in the room, a high-pitched, agonizing wail of absolute despair. He reached out, trying to push Clara away from his daughter, believing she was hurting her. Security moved in, but Clara, while continuing her compressions, looked over her shoulder, her face flushed with exertion. "No, hold him. Don't hurt him. Just keep him back. Look at me. Lily needs this. I am helping her heart beat." The room was a whirlwind of motion, the giant struggling against 3 grown men, his immense strength nearly overpowering them even in his weakened state, while Clara kept her focus entirely on the fragile chest beneath her palms, counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. For 2 agonizing minutes. The only sounds in the room were the mechanical hum of the ventilator, the rhythmic counting of Clara, and the heavy, broken breathing of the giant who had dropped to his knees again, held back by security, but watching his daughter's life hang by a thread. Dr. Harrison charged the defibrillator paddles. "Clear," he called out. Clara stepped back, her hands raised. The machine delivered the shock, and Lily's small body jolted slightly against the mattress. Everyone stared at the monitor. For 3 seconds, there was a flat line. The giant closed his eyes, his head dropping to the floor in total surrender. But then, a single, sharp beep echoed through the room. Then another. The rhythm stabilized into a weak but steady pattern. "She's back," Dr. Harrison breathed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We have a pulse." Clara sank against the counter, her legs shaking from the rush of adrenaline. She looked over at the father, whose eyes were wide, staring at the monitor as if trying to understand the green lines. He looked up at Clara, and 2 thick, heavy tears cleared paths through the mud and dried blood on his face. He reached out his hand, not to fight, but in a gesture of pure, unadulterated gratitude. Clara walked over and took his massive hand in both of her small ones, squeezing it tightly. As Lily was stabilized and prepared for transfer to the pediatric intensive care unit, Dr. Harrison insisted on treating the giant's injuries. The man refused to move from the bedside, so they had to bring the medical equipment to him. Clara stayed with him, translating his gestures and his short, written notes. They learned his name was Samuel. He lived in a small, isolated cabin deep in the ridge, completely off the grid. He had lost his speech years ago due to a severe childhood illness that had also caused his abnormal growth. The townspeople knew of him only as a myth, the giant of the ridge, and many feared him, spreading rumors that he was dangerous. But the truth was far different. He was a man who had chosen isolation to protect his daughter from the judgment of a world that didn't understand him. While Dr. Harrison prepared to pop Samuel's dislocated shoulder back into place, Evelyn noticed a strange object sticking out of Samuel's torn jacket pocket. It was an old, faded leather wallet, warped by the river water. As she pulled it out to check for legal identification, an old, laminated photograph slid out and landed on the floor near Clara's feet. Clara knelt down to pick it up, intending to hand it back to Samuel. But as her eyes brushed against the faded image, her entire world ground to a sudden halt. The photograph was 20 years old, its edges frayed and yellowed. It showed a young, smiling woman holding a newborn baby in front of a small, white house with a distinctive oak tree in the front yard. Clara knew that house. She knew that woman. The woman in the photograph was Clara's own mother, who had passed away in a tragic house fire when Clara was just a toddler. Clara's breath left her body in a sharp gasp, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped the picture. She looked up from the photograph to Samuel, her mind racing, trying to connect the impossible dots. Samuel was watching her, his expression suddenly changing from exhaustion to a profound, deep sorrow. He reached out and gently touched a small, faint scar on Clara's right wrist, a scar she had carried since she was 3 years old, a remnant of the night her childhood home burned to the ground. Samuel picked up the pen with a steady hand this time and wrote a single line on the pad of paper, turning it toward her. The note read, "I couldn't save your mother, but I got you out." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the steady beep of Lily's heart monitor. Clara stared at the giant, the pieces of her own fractured history falling into place with terrifying clarity. For her entire life, her grandfather had told her that a stranger, a man who refused to give his name, had broken through the flames of their burning home, pulled her from her crib, and disappeared into the night before the authorities arrived. The town had called it a miracle, but Clara had never known the identity of her savior. It was Samuel. He had lived with the guilt of the woman he couldn't save, carrying the physical scars of that night on his own body, hidden away in the mountains. He had watched Clara from afar as she grew up, knowing she had become a nurse, which was why, when his own daughter was dying, he bypassed every other clinic and ran straight to St. Jude's. He wasn't running blindly. He was running to the one person he believed carried the same spirit of survival. Clara looked at the man who had saved her life 20 years ago and who had now brought his own daughter to her to be saved in return. The rookie nurse, who had been doubted by everyone on the floor, didn't see a giant or monster. She saw a hero who had come full circle. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she leaned forward, wrapping her arms around Samuel's massive neck, burying her face in his shoulder. The entire trauma room stood in stunned silence, realizing that the chaotic events of the night weren't a random emergency, but a profound appointment with destiny. By the time the sun began to rise over the valley, painting the sky in soft hues of amber and gold, the storm had finally passed. Lily was sleeping peacefully in the pediatric unit, her color returned to a healthy pink, her prognosis excellent. Samuel sat in a chair beside her bed, his shoulder reset, his wounds cleaned and bandaged, looking smaller somehow, his face peaceful for the first time in decades. The story of what had happened in the ER had spread through the entire hospital, completely changing the way the staff looked at the quiet rookie nurse. Evelyn stood at the nurse's station, watching Clara chart her notes, a look of profound respect in her eyes. The world often looks at strength as something measured by physical power, by the ability to break through doors or overpower an opponent. But as Clara finished her shift and walked back into Lily's room to check on the family she had inadvertently been bound to since childhood, she knew the truth. True strength isn't found in the violence of a storm, but in the quiet courage to see past the fear, to listen to the silent cries of the broken, and to realize that sometimes the people who look the most dangerous are simply the ones carrying the heaviest burdens, waiting for someone to finally have the courage to help them put them down.